Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is George Makari. George is a historian, psychiatrist, and psychoanalyst. He served as the director of the Institute for the History of Psychiatry, and he is the author of three books. And today, we will speak about his latest book, Of Fear of Strangers, a history of xenophobia. George, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, George, only until recently, the past few years, no, actually, since Donald Trump was elected, I started hearing the word xenophobia more often. Before that, I knew it existed, but I didn't even know what it was. So we will get to that in a minute. But before we get to it, I would like to ask you about you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know from the book that you are a son of immigrants. I also would like to know why you chose to study history or psychiatry.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack there. So, yeah, my father was a scientist. Both my parents came from Lebanon to America. So I grew up here in the States as a son of Lebanese immigrants, and that was not really in the front of my mind when I started to think about a new topic for my book. As you say, I had written two books before, and I have a career that's kind of in between history and psychiatry and psychoanalysis. I run an institute of psychiatry that focuses on how the humanities can enrich our understanding of psychiatry and psychology. And so I wear two hats in that way. And, I think how I got there was, complicated road. I was going to be a doctor. I was very fascinated by writing and the humanities. And so I found a way to kind of bridge the two. And as you say, I had written a book. My first book was a history of the origins of psychoanalysis. My second was like a cultural history of the mind-brain problem as it informed the Enlightenment and the emergence of secular culture. And I was looking around for a new book project in 2016 when I was in London, and I was meeting with my agent. And at that time, my friends in London told me there was this thing called Brexit that was happening and that not to worry, it would never happen. And I told them Donald Trump would never get elected. And we all turned out to be very wrong. And so for me, like a lot of other people, xenophobia started to be a word that was repeated again and again and again. Of course, I knew what it was. I had heard of it, but it was always secondary to things like racism or anti-Semitism. And now it seemed to be maybe not so secondary. So I decided to look into it.
Right. So you say you wear two hats as a historian, as a psychiatrist, but in fact you wear three hats because you are also a writer. At what time in your life you decided to go into the quote unquote career of writing?
I'm not sure I ever thought of it as a career of writing. Writing has always been a passion for me. And so part of my challenge was how do I become a writer and do these other things? And so that was always, I think, more of a passion and something I had to find a way towards in the world. And so, I had a great mentor, the poet Michael Harper in college, and he always advised me, to do something in the world, get to know the world before you write. A lot of people want to write before they know anything about anything. And so, deciding to become a psychiatrist and a doctor and has informed all my writing. And so I think that was very good advice. It required a good deal of patience, but it was good advice.
So you are a son of Lebanese parents. I wonder, I assume your parents experienced some kind of racism. I wonder if you yourself experienced that or you were completely assimilated. You mentioned you don't have an accent. In your house, you spoke a melange of different languages. So, but your parents themselves, they couldn't assimilate. They couldn't speak English as well as you, for example. So did they experience any racism, and you yourself?
You know, I think obviously we did experience some bias, but I have to say it was relatively mild. I mean, my parents had the advantage of being very educated. My father had gone to English-speaking schools, so his English was really very good. My mother had gone to French-speaking schools. I think she had more trouble. Sure, there were moments in class where, the French teacher nicknamed me l'arabe, and things of that nature. I have to say that, America gave us a lot of room, and as long as we didn't make any kind of, as long as we laid low, if you will, there wasn't a problem. Sure, there were moments in class where Arabs were considered, quite devilish and bad people, and I had to sit there and say nothing. But I think that it would be wrong to suggest that I had anything like the experience that my African American friends have had.
Wow. Okay. So as you can detect, maybe by my accent, I come from a Latin American country. I also have light skin. So in my country, as in the United States, there is racism. And also, so I was racist when I was a little kid. And also I was a homophobic. And this is, I think I learned this through my culture or through my surrounding. And I wonder how innate is that in all of us to be some kind of, have some kind of phobia against other people. Is it natural, or is something that we learn from our environment?
Yeah. I think I would say it's both, that there is, a rather natural way that developing a sense of self and of self-worth can start out as in competition with someone who you're better than. That can be a rather natural thing. It isn't a very secure place to stay. It isn't a very strong way of developing self-worth, but it is a shaky way of doing it. And maybe we all do a little of that. I'm better than you because I'm this and you're that. But surely that's something that in adolescence we're supposed to emerge from, and have more of a sense of self that isn't predicated on someone who's less than us. That unfortunately doesn't happen with everybody. And it unfortunately is something that even when you get through that developmental stage, you can regress back to in cultural situations. So yeah, the stereotypes and the culture tells you who to choose from as the people who might be less than you. And so, there is this way that there's a pecking order in a particular society where they'll give you stereotypes, give you degraded others, and and people use those to secure their sense of self. It's not arbitrary, it's historically determined. So in the United States, of course, with indigenous people and African Americans, those were especially the ones who were, in the first case, savage and primitive, in the second case, less than human and worthy of enslavement. And that 400-year history, 500-year history has been part of then the ecosystem of the world that we live in and the stereotypes that we live in. And we've had to work to undo that. So that might be different in another place, where it might be very different who is looked down upon. So, I would say that the work that we have to do culturally is to examine those stereotypes and try to reflect on them, reveal them, and undo them. And the work that we have to do on the self, on ourselves, is to not predicate our own self-worth on the denigration of someone else.
Right. Okay. Well, I got rid of my phobias by exposure, by interacting with people from different races,
Sure.
different sex preferences. And I wonder if that's a solution that could be applied globally. And if so, I mean, how do we do it?
Yeah, you said you got over it by meeting these folks. Is that what you're saying?
Right,
Yeah, right, exactly.
interacting.
Well, I go through the different, in the second half of the book, I go through the different models for what causes xenophobia. And the first model is exactly what you just said. It says basically phobias come from fear-based associations, often with people that you don't know. There was, all of this research done by behaviorists that show that you could develop, fear of animals based on a white rat and a scary sound that the doctor would make every time a child saw a white rat. So there could be like one bad episode, and then forevermore you dislike a whole group of people. And if you bring those people together, the fearful person and the denigrated group, they get over it. That's called desegregation. In psychology, it's called habituation, in which case you get used to, oh, well, actually, the Chinese man isn't after me. He's not scary. There's nothing wrong with him. So adaptation that occurs through exposure and habituation is the political project, social project of desegregation. And that worked for you, right? The problem becomes, how do we make sense of those people who have those same xenophobic ideas and feelings without ever having met anyone from that group? And that's stereotypes as well. So we can't expose and desegregate everywhere. Some places, like, there's no one around that, one of the researchers found that in the 1920s, Americans hated more than anybody the Turks, and they didn't know any Turks.
Right.
So how would you desegregate? It's not about these, it's about cognitive stereotypes. So those are the two models that really you have a lot of really good research that shows how to make the situation better. As you say, bring people together and undermine these negative conceptions called stereotypes that teach them that to be afraid and to dislike and to diminish. The trickier problem is the group of people for whom those two solutions doesn't work. That's where we get into real trouble.
Right. And I think for myself, I live in a huge city where there is people from all races. And so I have no other alternative but to interact with everybody else. So I say, wow, this person, this guy who is homosexual, he has so much more in common with me that there's no reason for me to see him as different. I mean, we have more in common than uncommon. But I guess for people who live in rural villages, who everybody is the same eye color and the same hair color, and who are exposed to the same TV channel, that becomes a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. And you know what? That's one of the ironies, that you find some of the phobias of particular groups are, for instance, in Germany, the Syrian immigrants who came to Germany created a backlash, a right-wing backlash by a political group called the AfD, the Action for Germany, and they were vitriolic about these Syrian immigrants and the threats that they posed and the danger that they posed. And most of the AfD started in rural areas of the former East Germany where there were no Syrians. Right. So, I think that that's where you have to encounter the symbolic value of these ideas and the way that they're being deployed, and think about, maybe beyond stereotypes, beyond desegregation, there is a problem of subcultures of shame that actually feel much better by having a group that they hate and diminish. That's a darker place. That's not just about, well, we can teach everybody to not use stereotypes and bring everybody together, as you say, in your wonderful city, everyone seems to get along. But there is a darker part of the problem, which has to do with people who want to hate, not just are making a mistake, but they need to. And that's really where some of the models from psychoanalysis and the models based on projection start to give us some insight into what's happening.
Wow, I'm struck by the word needing to hate. That's difficult to digest. Okay, well, in your place as a historian, when I think of xenophobia, I think of the case of Nazi Germany, or the extermination of Native Americans, or maybe the enslavement of Black people. I wonder if those are the main cases of xenophobia in the modern world, or if you have any other to add to the list.
Unfortunately, there are many others to add to the list. The typical cases that were thought of that really made everyone recognize how big this problem was at first were three. The three were World War I, where ultranationalism was the form of bigotry. I hated you because you were French. You hated me because you were German, etc. And the way that created this mass slaughter was one of the first ways that, for instance, the concept of the stereotype was coined by a political journalist, Walter Lippmann, seeing how propaganda worked in World War I. The second was the genocide in the Congo, where King Leopold and his forces killed somewhere up to 10 million people in the Congo of African heritage. And that created little Congo reform associations around the world, the Western world. So that alerted people. And then, of course, the Holocaust. So you had three major catastrophic events with millions dead in each case that gave people these kinds of examples: ultranationalism, genocide against Africans, genocide against Jews. And now the question was, like, does anything link any of these together? Are they all different based on the fact that there are different groups that were killed? And I argue that xenophobia is a way of thinking about all of these together, that there might be common elements, although there are historically different elements to each of these, that we shouldn't just think of this problem based on which group is victimized, that we name most of these problems based on the victimized group. We call it homophobia, anti-Semitism, racism. Those are ways of naming the victimized groups. They're important words to maintain our sense of who we need to protect, but they all might have a common denominator. And xenophobia talks about the victimizer, not the victimized. It talks about what's going on in them. And so the claim that I make is that this is a word that helps us not get so caught up in which group, because we can choose groups and not see the irony in it. There was the Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist, who was a Black French psychiatrist, went to Algeria, and he came up with this really depressing insight. He said, the French hate the Jews, who hate the Arabs, who hate the Blacks, and you could see the circle continuing to turn. What is the common element here? And xenophobia, I argue, is a way of thinking about what might be some of the common elements. Surely there'll be elements that aren't common in each of these situations. And so, yeah, you find xenophobia, in South Africa. It's a big problem between, different African nations. You find xenophobia right now in France against Muslims. You find xenophobia in many different iterations in many different places based on different historical circumstances. And so it's important for us to be able to unify our thinking on this so that we can come up with unified solutions.
Right. I wonder to what extent all these phobias are magnified by the media. Like you open, I don't have a TV, but I see in YouTube, they vilifying not only of a different race, but also people who have different political belief. I have a friend, he's in his 60s, and he hates communism.
Yeah.
He seems like we are still in World War II era,
Yeah.
and the war. But funny enough, his daughters declared themselves socialists, so he has a lot of problem in his house. But yeah, I mean, to what extent all this is magnified by what we see in TV, for example?
Well, that's where the notion of the stereotype is so powerful, because the stereotype really was coined as film was being developed, as propaganda was going into this new phase where there was the capacity through film and then TV to almost replicate reality. Now we're about to go into the next phase, which is going to be even more difficult and scarier, I think, with virtual reality and the capacity on computers to completely confabulate reality. But the power of media to make people who have never been harmed by someone, this is D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, made people really alert. Oh my God, all these white folks can go to this movie. They've never had a bad encounter with a Black American, but they walk out with all of these very negative stereotypes because they've seen a movie, a piece of fiction. It was, at the time and still today, a very disturbing recognition. And with Meta, Facebook becoming Meta, and all of and the capacity to alter a reality based on social media and the web, we've seen how deeply, deeply problematic this is going to be for us now in the new digital age.
George, I have a million more questions, but we are running out of time. My last question, of course, is, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow you?
Yeah, the book is called Of Fear and Strangers, A History of Xenophobia. It's published in the United States by W.W. Norton and in the UK by Yale University Press, and it is available at all good bookstores near you.
George, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.